Good morning, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church in Idaho Falls. I am Annette Lovell, and I am your worship associate this morning, bringing you today's service with the Reverend Kevin Carson and our wonderful tech support, Josh Koyati and Vic Allen. I am Annette Lovell, and I am your worship associate this morning, bringing you today's service. We might be having some technical difficulties. Give me just one moment. We're good? We welcome you, whether this is your first time finding us online or whether you are a long-time member or friend. We welcome you with open heart and open arms as we journey together building our spiritual home. We seek for a place to belong, a place to feel rooted and secure, and we hope that this place, even without meeting in person together, fills that necessary connection. So welcome. As always, we'd like to start our service with a few announcements. First of all, we'd love to encourage you to sign in the chat box so we know who is joining us live this morning. Kevin Carson will host another social check-in on February 25th from 7 to 8 p.m. This will be on a Zoom platform, and we would like to encourage everyone to join in, get a chance to have him get to know you better, and you can also get to know him better. It's a wonderful thing. Also, Reverend Kevin is going to provide a 3-session online class on the history of Unitarian Universalists. It will be split up into 3 2-hour sessions, I said. One is the origin story. The second is the formative years, where we formed our identity. And the last class will be titled The UUA and Beyond. It sounds really interesting whether you are new to this faith or a longtime member. Again, it will be 2-hour sessions from 7 to 9, beginning in a few weeks. If you are interested in this class, please contact Kevin at minister@idahofallsuu.org. If you want to share a joy or a concern today, please type it in the chat box so that we can pull them together. Please remember to first indicate whether it is a joy, a concern, or a sorrow, and then type in the thought you would like for us to share on your behalf. And we will share this a little bit later in the service. And it would be remiss of me if we did not remind everyone that even though we are online, we are still a fully functioning church, and we depend on your financial generosity. So I encourage you to find time to visit our website, where you will find the Give button in the upper right-hand corner and pay via PayPal, or write a check and drop it in the P.O. box. All and any monetary donations are gratefully received. Now that all the business of our announcements are over, let us prepare for our sacred time of worship with a few moments for quiet intention and meditation. Take a moment to reflect on the blessings you have. Take a moment to remember all the people you love and who love you. Take a moment to be present with your body and your mind as you listen to your breaths and settle into sacredness. Imagine us all together, breathing in harmony as I ring the peace bowl 3 times. Our church's covenant helps us remember why we are part of this faith and why we give our time and resources to this congregation. I will read this morning the words of our covenant, and I encourage you to recite them along with me in your own homes. Love is the spirit of this community, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And our chalice lighting this morning comes from Andrew Pakula. Reverend Kevin will light our chalice. I will share these words. Let there be light, the light of joy, the light of happiness, and the light of contentment. May it illuminate our paths and fill our lives with peace. And let there be dark, for it is from our dark places that we are brought forward, tried and tested and impelled towards growth. It is in these places that we realize compassion and learn to love. And there was day, and there was night, and there was joy, and there was sorrow, and it was good.
Good morning. Our call to worship this morning is the poem The Gardener by Mary Oliver. Have I lived enough? Have I loved enough? Have I considered right action enough? Have I come to any conclusion? Have I experienced happiness with sufficient gratitude? Have I endured loneliness with grace? I say this, or perhaps I'm just thinking it. Actually, I probably think too much. Then I step out into the garden, where the gardener, who is said to be a simple man, is tending his children, the roses. I invite you to join in our opening hymn this morning, number 44, We Sing of Golden Mornings.
Today's Time for All Ages is entitled Moon Dragon in the Mosque Garden, written by El Farouk Kaki and Troy Jackson, illustrated by Katie Commodore. Papa T sticks his head into Tajali's room and he says, "I'm glad you like the clothes I made for you, but please put them on. We don't want to be late." Lots of people stop to greet them with hugs and kisses, saying, Assalamu alaikum and Eid Mubarak. Tajali sees his cousins Mujtaba and Asiya, and they run toward each other. Some people can't tell them apart, but Tajali always can. Tajali loves how his Unity Mosque is gray on the outside, but full of color on the inside. On a sunny day, every room is full of bright rainbows, and the biggest ones go to where the leader of prayer stands. And today, that's his big cousin Hajar, her first time. Tajali, Mujtaba, and Asiya cover Hajar in hugs and kisses before she goes to prepare. Asiya points to the old garden and says quietly, let's go outside. Tajali looks out, and just for a minute, it seems like he sees something purple. Yes, he says, just as Daddy E calls them all in to stand for prayers. After the prayers, which Hajar does perfectly, Auntie Amina starts to talk about the earth and stewardship. Tajali and his cousins bounce and fidget and try to follow. Auntie Amina gives them a stern look and says, We must all keep the promise to take care of our Mother Earth. After the talk finishes, Tajali and his cousins run for the sweets table and collect as many as they can. Eid al-Fitr is full of sweets and presents. Yum. Tajali, Mujtaba, and Asiya meet under the table with the lime green tablecloth so they can sneak out before their parents notice. Just when they get giggly and wiggly, Tajali's Papa T sticks his head under the table with a smile and says, Aha! The three cousins run outside, laughing. When they get outside into the sunshine, the twins snap off some twigs and whack wildly at the tall grass as they run off. Tajali kicks an empty bottle for a while. Asiya pulls flowers off a big bush and fills the fountain with them, while Mujtaba eats caramels and holds each wrapper up to wriggle until the wind carries it off. Suddenly, the wrappers start to fly back toward them, and empty bottles and other litter too. It's so gross. Who is doing that? Stop it, please, Tajali shouts. Come on, guys, let's get out of here, calls Mujtaba. Out of nowhere, a voice like a bubbling stream says, Didn't you learn anything from your Auntie Amina's sermon? The kids look all over until they see a shimmering, hazy purple shape of a small dragon. A breeze blows through the garden, ruffling its silvery feathers. You couldn't pronounce my name, says the dragon, tossing its head, so just call me Moondragon. That's what I am. Tajali asks, Where did you come from? How can you talk? What's a moondragon? Asks Mujtaba. Moondragon just smiles and shrugs. I asked first, Did you not learn anything from your Auntie Amina's talk? Were you just pretending to listen to her? Moondragon says. Moondragon shows Tajali, Mujtaba, and Asiya a trail of ants carrying leaves, food, and bits of things in procession. Look here, they are trying to use every bit wisely. Then it waves them on to a bunch of overgrown water lilies and points at them. They're full of bees. Here are more small things doing their job, so we get plenty of flowers and vegetables. So cute, says Moondragon, petting their fuzzy bums gently. In a blink of the Moondragon's silvery eyelashes, all three kids are shrunk down to the size of bees. Can you see how big a job it must be to them? And yet they work on, making it nicer and healthier. Tajali and his cousins start to understand. Just then, a caramel wrapper, 5 times their size, comes flying towards them. They duck. Moondragon makes everyone their regular size again with a flick of its tail. It's a lot of work to care for the earth, and you three have been very disrespectful to this garden. So now you cannot leave until it's all cleaned. If you don't help, you will be trapped in this garden forever. Then Moondragon starts to laugh. Just kidding. No one can make you give the earth your love and care, but I hope you will choose to join me and the ants and the bees. The kids all nodded and smiled. We will. Tajali and the twins help Moondragon. They pick up the garbage Trim the plants, scrub the stones, clear the fountain, and water everything. In no time, the garden is looking beautiful, but their Eid outfits are not. Daddy E and Papa T and Grandma Rose come outside looking for Tajali and his cousins. Just before they're going to scold the children, they notice how beautiful the garden looks. Tajali says, "Our friend Moondragon made us the size of bees and encouraged us to be nice to Mother Earth." "So imaginative, these children," Grandma Rose says. "Looks like Auntie Amina really inspired you. Now let's get home and clean so we can go visit friends." The end.
This is our time to share our joys and concerns with each other, that they may be lifted up in our UU community. We will read the messages that have been sent earlier this week, and then I will go to the chat box and read what has been posted there. If you haven't already done so, please type in your message now. It looks like we have a lot of sorrows and concerns this week, unfortunately. But let's have Reverend Kevin light candles. The first one is Davette Bogart is struggling with health issues related to her back surgery that she had in November. We want to make sure we still keep her in our thoughts and our prayers and send her any positive energy we could. Molly and Tom Brinkerhoff have lost their beloved dog Brindle on Friday. She will be sorely missed by them and for many of us that spend time in their home. I would like to light a candle for my friend Greg Shook, who is losing his battle with brain cancer and is near the end of his most momentous life. We have a sorrow from Cindy and Bill Miller. A dear friend of theirs, Bob Haggart, passed away last night. And finally, we have a joy from Lisa Christensen. She says, "Our daughter spent most of last year with us while we tried to figure out an illness. She is now living in Colorado, working and climbing. We are cautiously optimistic that the treatment is working." And Vic, are there any other joys or sorrows that you see in the chat box?
Allison McCready, two joys. They are on the vaccination list. And joy number 2, thanks Elizabeth for the great story.
Excellent.
Elizabeth has shared a joy that Clarissa's writer's block is gone. So good for her.
Wonderful. Nice to get some joys in there. If there are no others, we will light one additional candle for all of those joys, sorrows, and concerns which we are not ready to share at this time.
I have 2 readings this morning. The first is an excerpt from the chapter on rest in the book Consolations, the Solace, Nourishment, and Underlying Meaning of Everyday Words by David White. A deep experience of rest is the template of perfection in the human imagination, a perspective from which we are able to perceive the outer specific forms of our work and our relationships, whilst being nourished by the shared foundational gift of the breath itself. From this perspective, we can be rested while putting together an elaborate meal for an arriving crowd, whilst climbing the highest mountain or sitting at home surrounded by the chaos of a loving family. Rested, we are ready for the world, but not held hostage by it. Rested, we care again for the right things and the right people in the right way. In rest, we reestablish the goals that make us more generous, more courageous, more of an invitation, someone we want to remember, and someone others would want to remember too. My second reading is an excerpt from the book Nature and the Human Soul, Cultivating Wholeness and Community in a Fragmented World by Bill Plotkin. Of all the possible ways to identify what we mean by soul, I prefer ultimate place, because it extracts us from the troubling and messy implication that the soul is something material, or just as unworkable, that it is something private, inner, invisible, ethereal, or celestial. The soul of a thing, though certainly not a tangible object, is nevertheless, and in principle, publicly observable, in the same sense that a love affair is observable, and usually not inner, invisible, or ethereal, or in the same way a theatrical performance, a touchdown, a faux pas, an embarrassment, or a victory is observable. We wouldn't say that any of those things was merely a physical object or an inner event, and yet we have no doubt about their existence and their significance to us. When you know a mature person well enough, someone who has consciously uncovered her soul to some degree and is consciously living it, you can see her doing it right here on earth. Her soul is not inner, invisible, or private. My reason for wanting to rescue soul from the material and the ethereal is that both these notions about the soul buy into the profoundly unfortunate and unnecessary Cartesian split between inner and outer, between mind and matter. Material reduces psychology to neurology, and ethereal might as well be unreal. Before the pandemic, back when I worked in Rhode Island, I would often pray while driving to work in the morning, and this is sometimes the case even these days driving around Idaho. The reason had nothing to do with the perils of driving in Rhode Island, which admittedly could be a frightening ordeal, but what it meant was that I was neglecting to dedicate time in my daily schedule for even a few quiet moments of genuine meditation. Generally, I try to pray every morning with a focus on gratitude, to orient myself to a new day with a positive mental attitude. And in warm weather, I prefer to do this sitting outside. And to be most effective, it is important that any such practice be consistent. Beginning the day in gratitude can be very tough when I find myself struggling to hold back the tears of grief or despair for the world. But those are the times when it is most important. When the morning routine is so rushed that I'm praying behind the wheel, it is a warning sign that I really need to slow down, step back, and find some time for stillness and solitude, that I'm allowing the frenzy of modern living to gain the upper hand despite my best intentions. Even the desire to do good in this world can become overly consuming, and sometimes it is better to prioritize and say no. Ministers and people of similar professions dedicated to serving others are notoriously bad at being able to throttle back when we should. But lately, this seems to apply to almost everybody. If we can speak of any good that has come from the pandemic, it is that it has at least forced us to slow down and not overburden ourselves and our families with activities, even ones we enjoy. But it is hard to tell, though, if this will make up for the stress and anxiety of adapting to the sudden change foisted upon us. Study after study has confirmed that engaging in some form of meditation or prayer is extremely beneficial to our physical and mental health, and I would add spiritual health as well. We all need to find ways to slow down and tend the garden of our soul. But what exactly is this soul that needs tending? The word soul is one of those vague spiritual words we throw around as if everyone knew what it meant, and is made worse by the way the word soul is often used in many non-spiritual ways. You hear people talk about the soul of a nation, or that poor soul, or that music really stirs my soul. But in spiritual or theological terms, what does soul mean to us? Historically, our Christian ancestors used to worry a great deal about the salvation of their souls based on the belief that it was the immortal spirit half of our dual nature as children of God. That when we die, our souls leave our material bodies and enter either into heavenly bliss or perhaps some period of punishment or even eternal damnation. It was a very big deal and still is to many people. Wars have even been fought over who had the correct understanding of how all of this worked. In the Eastern religious traditions, there's a similar concept of an immortal soul. For example, the so-called indwelling self of the Hindu tradition. With a belief in the law of karma and that each soul is reborn in multiple cycles of reincarnation, how one lived in the current lifetime had implications for your status in the next. But despite the appealing idea that death was only a doorway to the next rebirth, the thought of endless cycles of rebirth presents its own existential challenges about the meaning of life. Are we merely stuck in endless cycles of rebirth with all the suffering and sorrow that comes with each new life? It seems rather pointless. A solution to this dilemma came from the Buddha, who presented the innovative idea that one could eventually reach enlightenment and find escape and peace, escaping the endless rebirths. And this idea became codified as one of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. And these are just a couple of examples of how humanity has imagined the idea of the soul. You can see something similar in almost every culture throughout history. Life and death have always been with us, of course. It is easy to observe the beginnings of life with the first breath taken by a newborn and the moment of death when we breathe no more. To any observer, it seems obvious that something is present in our living bodies that allows us to be alive, and that when we die, that something leaves us in some mysterious way. There are other ways of imagining the soul, though, as suggested by the reading this morning from Bill Plotkin, who is a depth psychologist and spiritual writer. In the reading, he uses the metaphor of the soul being the niche, that the ultimate place that each of us occupies in the universe, that special niche that is uniquely distinguishes us as individual beings within the interdependent web of life. In an earlier book, Plotkin described the soul a little differently, but in a similar vein, as the vital, mysterious, and wild core of our individual selves, an essence unique to each person, qualities found in layers of the self much deeper than our personalities. He goes on to distinguish the soul from the ego, which he suggests is the outward-facing part of our being, which interacts with the world. The soul for Plotkin lies deeper, or is at best described metaphorically, though it is no less real than our ego. As you can see, we are still left tripping over language when we try to describe this elusive soul. As modern, theologically diverse folks, we may find one or none of these concepts to have much meaning for us. But I believe we have an intuitive feeling that there is something vital and alive deep within each of us that is more than simply being a living organism. So for the sake of continuing my sermon, I ask you to accept that each of us has a soul in some form that works for you, even if it is merely a metaphor. How the soul relates to the divine, the sacred mystery, or God, or whatever you want to call it, is the next question. It is common to hear the term spirit when this question is discussed, whether it is the Holy Spirit of the Judeo-Christian tradition or something less theologically defined. Plotkin, for instance, describes spirit as the single great and eternal mystery that permeates and animates everything in the universe and yet transcends all. And each soul is an agent of the Spirit. I believe that a transcendentalist like Ralph Waldo Emerson would be okay with such a definition, since it sounds a lot like his concept of the oversoul. And honestly, I find this generally works for me as well. But here again, the language is necessarily fuzzy and speaks of mystery. Even among the religious traditions that believe they have a certainty about their claims to truth, there are typically dissenting opinions among the mystical fringes that point to the folly of such thinking. Soul and spirit remain elusive. By the 16th century, a number of Christian mystics had spent considerable time wrestling with the concept of the soul and spiritual development. Among the most famous thinkers in this realm was the Spanish nun Teresa of Avila, who lived between 1515 and 1582, and her protege, the Carmelite friar and priest known as John of the Cross, who lived between 1542 and 1591. Teresa was very popular and quickly canonized as Saint Teresa in 1622. Known for her ecstatic visions, she is the subject of the magnificent sculpture by Bernini called The Ecstasy of St. Teresa of Avila, completed in 1653, which is located in the Santa Maria della Vittoria Church in Rome. You may recall that the sculpture was featured in the plot of Dan Brown's novel and subsequent movie, Angels and Demons. Well, Teresa and John wrote extensively about spirituality, and they're most often associated with the idea of the dark night of the soul. And while the complexities of the dark night are a topic for a different sermon, let me just say that it generally describes a time of spiritual crisis in your life, in your journey toward union with the sacred, in which all your basic assumptions and beliefs seem to have abandoned you. It is a moment of crisis, but it is one filled with potential. Today I want to focus on what Teresa said about nurturing the soul on the journey through a variety of prayer practices. And please note Though her language and theology were understandably Christian, if you're more familiar with an Eastern contemplative practice, you will probably recognize a lot of similarities. And I would suggest translating these into ideas in a form that works for you. Practices like these are internal work and transcend any theology or singular tradition. And I would argue that they are more psychological than theological. Even the most skeptical humanist can benefit from mindfulness or some other form of contemplative practice as a means of reducing stress and coping with despair. Many companies are even offering mindfulness meditation classes for their employees these days, recognizing the practical benefits of such practices. In her first book, titled Life, written several years before she met John of the Cross, Teresa imagined the human soul not as something a person has, but who a person is at the deepest core of one's being. She used the metaphor of the soul as a garden, where the flowers are the virtues planted there for us by God, who dwells in the center of the garden. Since we are creatures in the image of God, the tilling and planting of the garden has already been done for us, and we need only water the garden through our spiritual practices to make it bloom and thrive. The water in her metaphor was prayer, which she described as existing in 4 grados, or grades, beginning with meditation, which involves a more active use of the faculties, and proceeding through deeper and deeper layers of contemplation. The modern spiritual author Gerald May describes these layers very nicely in one of his books, so let me paraphrase the way he described Teresa's 4 grades of prayer. The first way of prayer, meditating on a passage of Scripture or perhaps something in the life of Jesus, is like drawing water from a well and carrying the water to our interior garden. It is an active form of spiritual practice that can open us to God and bring us moments of powerful gratitude or beauty, what Teresa called contentos. The problem with such a practice is that, like fetching water from a well, it can be tiring after a while, and we may endure long periods without those contentos to bring us joy. Part of our discontent, she said, comes from feeling that we are doing all the work, when in reality, we could do nothing without God's grace. This introduces her second grade of prayer, which she called the prayer of quiet. And it is the first taste of the contemplative practice and experience. And centering prayer is a good example of the quiet prayer practice she describes. If you aren't familiar with centering prayer, it is a practice of sitting in silence and trying to still the mind by lightly returning to the thought of a sacred word such as peace whenever we find our internal chatter acting up. Usually this is done for periods of about 20 minutes to allow the mind time to quiet down. It is an ancient monastic practice that has seen a revival among many Christians in recent decades thanks to the work of the late Father Thomas Keating, who was a Trappist monk from St. Joseph's Abbey in Spencer, Massachusetts. During contemplation, we may experience moments of what Teresa called gustos, which we might call flashes of insight. She would say that contentos arise within us and are directed to God, but gustos arise from God and are directed toward us. In her garden watering metaphor, the state of prayer is compared to a water wheel that we simply crank slowly as the real work of moving the water is done by the wheel. As they teach in centering prayer, it is important to relinquish any expectations that we will experience moments of insight, but instead allow them to rise as they may or may not. Her third way of prayer is compared to an adjacent spring or stream that provides water for the garden, soaking its roots and requiring very little effort from us, Perhaps we dip our bucket in once in a while to make sure a few flowers are really nourished. Her point was that now we acknowledge God is doing almost everything within us, and this may bring us many experiences of the gustos, of feeling the divine presence. Eventually, with ongoing practice, and she would add the grace of God, we may enter the fourth way of prayer, in which we intuitively understand our inseparability from God. She called it the prayer of union, which is likened to rainfall watering the soul's garden. In such deep contemplative practice, we may experience moments of profound spiritual unity, but they're usually very fleeting, even for the most dedicated among us. Even for Teresa, such moments rarely lasted more than a few minutes. She wrote that she could not remember one lasting more than half an hour in her entire lifetime. So those are the 4 grades of prayer in the spiritual practice system developed by Teresa of Avila. And maybe you're now eager to head to some quiet spot and start praying. What I think is important about the practices Teresa outlined is that they acknowledge a need for passivity. Tending the garden of the soul sounds like an active practice at first glance, but Teresa explained, beyond the effort to carve out a time and space for quiet practice, the deeper one enters into contemplative practice, the more we are called to passivity and relinquishing our thoughts. It is a journey of increasing unity with what I call the sacred mystery. And by its nature, it requires a certain degree of dissolution of our individuated sense of self. This can be very hard, especially when we don't allow ourselves adequate rest or quiet time. We are also so used to being individual selves that we may even fear letting go even for a moment. It is so much easier to fill the gaps in our busy schedules with the noise of daily life, with our turbulent world as a backdrop. But I don't think this is what nature intended for us. I'm reminded of my favorite haiku from the poet Matsuo Basho, who wrote, "Sitting quietly, doing nothing, spring comes and the grass grows by itself." Let me say that again. Sitting quietly, doing nothing, spring comes and the grass grows by itself. How many of us take enough time to sit quietly and do nothing? Whether you adopt some prayer or meditation practice, or you find some quiet place to sit in the woods, or you discover some other routine that brings you to your interior peace, it is important to find some means of resting and nurturing your soul. We can do so much more good in the world by stepping back from it from time to time. As David White said in the reading, rested, we are ready for the world, but not held hostage by it. Spring is such a wonderful time of new beginnings. And regardless of what the groundhog said, spring will arrive in a few more weeks. Just having warmer weather to get outside and watch the earth come alive fills me with some of those contentos Teresa described. So in the weeks to come, as the snow melts, the flowers begin to poke through the soil, and the grass begins to grow by itself, I challenge you to tend the garden of your soul, to feel the spirit of life flowing through you and pouring out like rain upon the world. I invite you to join now in our closing hymn, number 12, O Life That Maketh All Things New.
The blooming earth our thoughts within
Our closing words are the poem Where Breathing is Prayer by Wendell Berry. Sit and be still until in the time of no rain you hear beneath the dry winds commotion in the trees, the sound of flowing water among the rocks, a stream unheard before, and you are where breathing is prayer.
We will now extinguish our chalice with the following words. If you wish, please join with me. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. And please join us for our virtual coffee hour directly after the service. The email was included in today's order of service. It is time for our postlude. Be safe and be well.